There's a specific kind of silence that fills a room when a 29-year-old visionary fires you from the company you built. Huxley Vane didn't look me in the eye. He just stared at his iPad, reading a termination script written by his snake of a consultant. They called my 20 years of operational architecture legacy bloat. They thought they were just cutting an expensive salary to boost quarterly margins. They didn't realize they were actually cutting the brake lines on a Ferrari moving at 200 miles per hour. Before I tell you how my silent exit triggered a federal investigation that cost them $40 million, let me know in the comments if you've ever had to train the person who eventually fired you. And if you love seeing competence destroy arrogance, hit that subscribe button. You're going to enjoy this one. My name is Rowena Kincaid, and for the last 25 years, I have served as the Chief Operating Officer of Aura Biotech, a specialized logistics firm nestled in the industrial heart of New Jersey that I personally cultivated from a chaotic startup in a rented garage into the undisputed global leader in ultra-cold chain pharmaceutical transport. I am 52 years old, a woman who has always preferred the brutal, binary honesty of operational data to the deceptive pleasantries of corporate small talk, and I possess a mind that functions with the same unyielding precision as the temperature-controlled environments I design. My office on the 12th floor, a space I had occupied for 2 decades, was always maintained at exactly 68 degrees Fahrenheit, a thermal setting that many of my younger colleagues found uncomfortably crisp, but which I found absolutely essential for maintaining the mental clarity required to orchestrate a supply chain that moves $4 billion of volatile biological agents across 6 continents annually. On the Monday morning that would define the catastrophic end of my tenure, the air in that room felt decidedly brittle, stripped of oxygen and warmth by the intrusion of 2 men who had no business standing on my Persian carpet. Huxley Vane, the 29-year-old son of our founder, stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, nervously adjusting a platinum cufflink with the jittery energy of a man who knows he is an imposter in his own life. Beside him sat Silas Mercer, a management consultant with a smile that didn't reach his predatory eyes and a notorious reputation for gutting healthy companies to inflate their short-term stock value before parachuting out with a massive fee. They did not offer me the courtesy of a conversation about the successful weekend distribution cycle, nor did they ask about the complex negotiations I had just finalized with our suppliers in Zurich to lower our overhead by 15%. Instead, Silas opened a sleek, black leather portfolio and began to read from a prepared script, his voice dripping with the kind of corporate condescension that usually masks deep insecurity and a profound lack of understanding of the business he was purporting to save. Silas spoke with a rhythmic, practiced cadence about strategic realignment and the urgent necessity for a digital-first leadership team, utilizing hollow buzzwords like legacy bloat, fiscal, redundancy, and structural optimization to describe my 25 years of sleepless nights, missed holidays, and operational mastery. They told me, without a hint of irony, that my salary was an unnecessary weight on the company's earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, the holy grail of EBITDA that consultants worship like a false idol, and that my termination was effective immediately. I sat there, my hands folded calmly on the surface of the mahogany desk I had paid for with my own performance bonus 15 years ago, and listened to them dismantle my career with the casual indifference of a gardener pruning a dead branch. They were completely unaware that they were not merely firing an employee. They were reaching into the complex machinery of a nuclear reactor and removing the graphite control rods while the core was still burning white-hot. I watched Huxley's reflection in the glass of the window. He was studiously avoiding my gaze, staring out at the parking lot where his brand-new Porsche was parked in the spot reserved for the CEO. A spot he believed he had earned by birthright. He looked like a child wearing his father's suit, terrified that someone might ask him a question he couldn't answer with a slogan he learned in business school. When Silas finally finished his monologue, which ended with a curt demand for the immediate return of my company assets and my signature on a comprehensive release of claims, I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not threaten legal action or beg for a second chance to prove my worth. I knew something they did not. Competence is not a job title you can strip away with a memo. It is the infrastructure upon which the entire building rests, and without me, they were standing on quicksand. I reached into the inner pocket of my charcoal blazer and withdrew a small, titanium-reinforced security key. It was a YubiKey, no larger than a standard flash drive, but infinitely more significant. I placed it gently on the desk, the metal making a sharp, deliberate click against the wood that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. This was not merely a key to the front door or a simple password keeper. It was a cryptographic hardware token linked directly to my biometrics, my unique fingerprints, and the vascular pattern of my retinas. It was the sole mechanism authorized by the Food and Drug Administration to release Class A pharmaceutical shipments from our quarantine zones. I looked Huxley in the eye for the first time since he entered the room, forcing him to lift his chin and meet my gaze. I asked him quietly, with the measured tone of a school teacher addressing a slow student, if he understood the implications of removing the only designated qualified person from the facility during a live distribution cycle. I watched his eyes flick to Silas for reassurance, a reflex of dependency. Silas gave a dismissive nod, a silent signal that I was merely bluffing to save my job. Huxley scoffed, a sound of pure, unearned arrogance, and told me that he had a Master of Business Administration from Stanford and was perfectly capable of managing a warehouse without my archaic oversight. He snatched the key from the desk and dropped it into his pocket as if it were loose change, dismissing the very object that protected his family's fortune from regulatory collapse. I stood up, smoothed the front of my jacket, and picked up my handbag. I left the photos of my team on the wall. I left the industry awards on the shelf. I walked past them without another word, the sound of my heels on the hardwood floor echoing the finality of the moment. I did not look back at the empire I had built. I simply walked to the elevator, rode it down to the lobby in silence, past the weeping receptionist whom I had hired 10 years ago, and stepped out into the blinding morning sun. I checked my watch. It was 8:15. The daily shipment of $40 million worth of insulin was scheduled for release at 9 o'clock, and the clock was already ticking on a disaster they couldn't even comprehend. The silence that followed my departure was deceptive, a brief interlude before the machinery of the company began to realize its operator was gone. To understand the gravity of their mistake, one must understand that Aura Biotech does not move boxes of cereal or pallets of furniture. We move living biological agents that degrade the moment they experience a temperature fluctuation of even half a degree. The systems controlling this environment are not standard off-the-shelf software packages. They are custom-built architectures I designed myself, layering federal compliance protocols over security algorithms to satisfy the stringent requirements of the FDA's 21 CFR Part 11 regulations regarding electronic records and signatures. I walked 3 blocks to a coffee shop called The Daily Grind, a place I hadn't visited in years because I never had the time. I ordered a pot of Earl Grey tea, sat by the window, and opened my personal iPad. I wasn't logging into the company server as an employee. I was accessing the back end as the owner of the intellectual property, monitoring the heartbeat of the system I had created. At 8:50, 10 minutes before the trucks were scheduled to depart for the airport to catch the international flights to Geneva, the logs showed activity. Huxley had sat down at my desk. I could visualize him there, adjusting the ergonomic chair that he didn't know how to operate, flexing his fingers before the keyboard. He attempted to log into the central command system to authorize the shipment. He likely expected a simple password prompt, something he could override with his father's administrative credentials, assuming that power was hierarchical and that the title of Chief Executive Officer granted him omnipotence over code. Instead, the massive video wall in the logistics command center, which monitored the thermal status of every pallet in the facility, flashed a bright, warning amber. The system was requesting the digital signature of the designated qualified person to verify that the batch records had been reviewed and were compliant with federal safety standards. This was not a feature that could be disabled in a settings menu. It was a hard-coded legal requirement embedded into the source code, a dead man's switch designed to prevent unauthorized personnel from moving dangerous medical goods. When Huxley tried to bypass the prompt using his father's login, the system paused. I could see the query hitting the server. User: A. Vane, admin. Authority level: executive. Certification: none. The algorithm validated the credentials against the required authority matrix, and finding them insufficient to sign off on a biological release, the screen turned from amber to a violent, flashing red. The heartbeat protocol had failed. The system realized the qualified person was missing, and it reacted exactly as I had programmed it to react in the event of a security breach. The chaos that ensued was immediate, physical, and terrifying for anyone inside that building. A siren began to wail softly in the server room, a sound designed to alert the technical team of a serious security breach. The text on the screen changed to read, "Unauthorized access attempt. Digital chain of custody broken. Automatic lockdown initiated." Down in the loading bay, the massive steel doors of the refrigerated warehouse, which were thick enough to stop a truck and insulated to withstand a fire, slammed shut, driven by hydraulic locking mechanisms designed to prevent theft. The sound would have been deafening, a metallic thunderclap that shook the floor. The forklifts, midway through loading pallets onto the waiting refrigerated trucks, stopped dead as their wireless control signals were severed by the central computer. The drivers, who were on strict schedules to meet international cargo flights and were paid by the mile, stepped out of their cabs, confused and angry, their engines idling in the morning air, spewing exhaust into a loading dock that was rapidly becoming a parking lot. Back in the executive suite, the phone lines began to light up. Silas Mercer, realizing that his narrative of a smooth transition was crumbling, told Huxley not to worry. He claimed this was just a glitch, a final act of petty sabotage by a disgruntled employee, a logic bomb I must have left behind. They summoned David, the director of information technology, a capable but timid man who arrived sweating and terrified, his tie askew. He typed furiously for 5 minutes, his fingers flying across the keyboard, trying to execute root commands to bypass the lock. He stopped, staring at the code, the blood draining from his face. He turned to the new CEO with a look of absolute horror to explain that he could not reset the system because the encryption keys were not hosted on Aura Biotech's local servers. They were hosted remotely by a third-party intellectual property firm, and without the biometric handshake from my titanium key, the software assumed the facility had been compromised by hackers and had entered a defensive stasis mode to protect the data integrity. Silas, seeing his commission at risk and his reputation as a fixer threatened, demanded to know who owned this third-party firm. He accused David of incompetence, shouting that they paid millions a year in IT budget. He dug through the vendor contracts filed in the dusty cabinets of the legal department, flipping through pages of legalese until he found the software licensing agreement. He found the name, the Athena Protocol, LLC. He didn't recognize it. Why would he? When he dialed the number listed on the contract, expecting a vendor he could bully into submission, he reached my voicemail. The recording was my voice, calm and professional, stating that the software license was contingent upon the active employment of the primary administrator, me, and that any attempt to circumvent this protocol would be considered a violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. I can only imagine the silence in the room as the voicemail ended. They were locked out of their own house, and I was holding the only key, sitting 3 blocks away, sipping tea and watching the system health indicator on my iPad turn from green to red. While they were paralyzed by the technical lockdown, a second, far more dangerous financial mechanism was clicking into gear hundreds of miles away. My resignation had triggered an automatic notification to the private equity firm and the banking consortium that held the debt for the company's recent aggressive expansion into the European market. Alistair Vane, the founder and Huxley's father, was at his vineyard in Napa Valley. He was likely sitting on his terrace, overlooking the rows of grapes, believing his legacy was safe in the hands of his son, perhaps toasting to his own retirement. His phone rang. It was not his son. It was the senior vice president of Chase Manhattan Bank, a man named Marcus Sterling who did not make social calls on Monday mornings. The banker informed him that a key person clause in their loan agreement had been activated. This clause, which I had insisted on inserting years ago to protect the company from exactly this kind of nepotism, stipulated that if I, Rowena Kincaid, left the company without a 6-month transition period, the risk profile of the corporation would be reassessed immediately. The bank was formally notifying him that they were exercising their right to increase the interest rate on the company's $50 million line of credit from a manageable 4% to a punitive 25%, effective immediately. Furthermore, they were freezing all outgoing wire transfers until a forensic audit could be performed to ensure assets weren't being stripped. Alistair dropped his phone in shock, the device clattering onto the stone patio. He realized in that moment that in his absence, his son hadn't just fired a manager, he had effectively triggered a default event that could bankrupt the family and seize their assets within 48 hours. He tried to call Huxley, but the line was busy. He tried to call me. I watched his name appear on my phone screen. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. I wasn't ready to save them yet. They hadn't bled enough. Back at the headquarters, the situation had escalated from a technical glitch to a full-blown operational crisis. It was now 10 o'clock. The sun was climbing higher, heating the asphalt of the loading dock. The insulin shipment was an hour late. The client, Geneva Pharmaceuticals, a massive European conglomerate known for its ruthlessness, was calling the logistics desk, demanding to know why their cargo tracking numbers showed stationary instead of en route. Silas, desperate to save face and maintain the illusion of control, instructed the customer service team to lie. He told them to claim it was a mechanical issue with the trucks, a flat tire, a breakdown, anything to buy time. He forgot that the client had access to the same real-time data dashboard we did, provided by my software through a secure portal. The client could see the FDA protocol violation banner flashing on their screens in bold red letters. This wasn't just a delay, it was a regulatory red flag. If the temperature data wasn't uploaded within 2 hours, the entire shipment, worth $40 million, would be deemed adulterated by international standards and would have to be incinerated. The client rep was screaming at our dispatchers, threatening to invoke the penalty clauses in our service-level agreement. Huxley was panicking, sweating through his bespoke suit, his face pale and clammy. He was screaming at Juno, the head of compliance, demanding she fix it. Juno, a woman of integrity who had been my eyes and ears for a decade, stood her ground. She informed him calmly that federal law required a qualified person to sign off. She explained that since he had fired the only one, he had 2 options: rehire me immediately and beg for forgiveness, or wait 6 months to validate a new officer with the authorities. Silas Mercer, seeing the walls closing in and no other way out, pulled Huxley into the far corner of the office, away from the ears of the terrified staff. He whispered a plan that was as desperate as it was illegal. He recalled seeing in the old system logs that I had a backup admin account, a ghost profile used for system testing and disaster recovery drills. He suggested they force a password reset on that account and use it to spoof my digital signature. "She's gone, she won't know," Silas whispered, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped rat. "We just need to get the trucks moving. Once the shipment is in the air, we can blame the glitch on the software update. No one goes to jail for a bug." Huxley looked at the clock. The insulin had been sitting in the ambient zone for 90 minutes. Every minute that passed brought them closer to a $40 million write-off. He looked at his phone, still buzzing with his father's frantic calls. He looked at Silas, the devil on his shoulder offering a way out. He nodded. As they scrambled to execute this clumsy forgery, I poured myself a second cup of tea. The steam rose in the sunlight. I watched the entire disaster unfold on my iPad via the secure Vance Ventures portal. I watched the server logs as they used a brute force root command to reset the password on the backup account. I saw Huxley's terminal log in as admin RK Ghost. They were about to commit wire fraud, signing a federal document with a falsified identity, an act that carried a mandatory prison sentence if caught. I could have stopped them. I could have engaged the kill switch that wiped the server clean, but I didn't. I took a sip of tea and let them proceed, because I knew that true revenge isn't about stopping your enemy from making a mistake. It's about letting them make the mistake that destroys them completely. I watched the progress bar load on my screen. They navigated to the batch release form. They checked the box certifying safety. They clicked sign and release. The screen in their office turned green for 3 seconds, a moment of false victory where they likely cheered and high-fived before turning pitch black. A new window appeared, typing itself out across their monitors. Fraudulent signature detected. Biometric mismatch. Audit log sealed. Automatic report sent to the Office of Criminal Investigations. The trap had snapped shut. The game was no longer about profit margins or EBITDA, it was about prison sentences and indictments. I closed my iPad, paid my bill, and stood up. It was time to go back. I walked out of the coffee shop and headed toward the building, knowing that when I walked through those glass doors, I wouldn't just be walking in as an employee. I would be walking in as the owner of everything they thought they controlled, ready to dictate the terms of their surrender. The 7-minute walk from the corner cafe back to the towering glass monolith of Aura Biotech felt less like a commute and more like a funeral procession for a dynasty that had effectively ended 3 hours ago. The midday sun was hammering down on the asphalt of the industrial park, creating shimmering waves of heat that distorted the air, mirroring the distortion of reality that was currently occurring on the 12th floor. As I approached the building, the tangible debris of Huxley's catastrophic leadership was already visible on the sidewalk. A cluster of our senior logistics drivers, men and women who were paid by the mile and prided themselves on military precision, were standing near the loading dock entrance, smoking cigarettes with jagged, angry motions. They weren't just idle, they were grounded. I could hear the static of their radios, silent except for the occasional confused query from a dispatcher who had no answers to give. When I reached the revolving doors, Robert, the head of security who had been instructed to escort me out like a criminal earlier that morning, was waiting. He didn't ask for the badge that was currently burning a hole in Huxley's pocket. Instead, he stepped forward, his face etched with relief, and held the door open with a reverence usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. "Mr. Vane Sr. landed on the helipad 10 minutes ago," Robert murmured, his voice low to avoid the ears of the nervous reception staff. "He looked like a man walking to the gallows, Miss Kincaid. They are all in the main boardroom, waiting for you." I thanked Robert with a slight nod, stepped into the cool, recycled air of the lobby, and walked straight to the elevators. I did not rush. Panic is for people who do not have a plan. I had a blueprint. The ride to the 12th floor took exactly 32 seconds. I used that half-minute to center myself, adjusting the cuffs of my blazer and visualizing the capitalization table of the company in my mind. When the elevator doors slid open, the silence that greeted me was heavy, suffocating, and smelled faintly of stale coffee and fear. The open-plan office, usually a hive of kinetic energy where analysts tracked global shipments, was frozen in a state of suspended animation. Staff members sat at their desks, staring at blank screens or whispering into phones, but when they saw me walking down the central corridor, the whispering stopped. Heads turned. Eyes followed me. There was no judgment in their gazes anymore, only a desperate hope. They knew the ship had hit an iceberg, and they were watching the only person capable of welding the hull walk back onto the bridge. I ignored them all, focusing entirely on the double mahogany doors at the end of the hall. I didn't knock. I didn't pause. I pushed the doors open and stepped into the room that I owned in every way that mattered. The scene inside the boardroom was a study in devastation. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, but no one was looking outside. Alistair Vane sat at the far end of the long table, his head in his hands, his usually immaculate silver hair disheveled. He looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by the realization that his legacy was evaporating. To his right sat Huxley, the boy king who had burned his kingdom down in a single morning. He was slumped in his chair, his bespoke suit jacket discarded on the floor, his face pale and slick with sweat. And then there was Silas Mercer. The consultant was pacing the length of the room like a caged animal, barking into his cell phone, likely trying to move his assets offshore before the lawsuits hit. When the door clicked shut behind me, the sound was like a gavel striking a sound block. Silas snapped his phone shut and spun around, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of aggression and panic. Huxley straightened up, looking at me with the terrified expression of a child who has broken a priceless heirloom. Alistair slowly lifted his head, and the raw shame in his eyes was almost enough to make me hesitate. Almost. "You have some nerve showing your face here," Silas sneered, attempting to regain control of the room by going on the offensive. He walked toward me, pointing a manicured finger. "You sabotaged the mainframe. We have IT logs proving you planted a logic bomb to lock us out. That is corporate espionage, Rowena. It is a felony. We are preparing a motion to have you arrested before you can even sit down." I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I walked past him as if he were a piece of office furniture, placed my handbag on the head of the table, my seat, and connected my iPad to the room's display system. "I did not plant a bomb, Silas," I said, my voice calm, modulated, and echoing slightly in the large room. "I built a biometric lock, a safety mechanism designed to prevent unqualified individuals from mishandling dangerous biological agents. You and Huxley decided to try and pick that lock with a sledgehammer, and when the alarm went off, you blamed the security company. That is not sabotage. That is incompetence meeting consequences." I tapped the screen of my tablet. The projector hummed to life, displaying the stark red text of the server logs I had captured earlier. User: admin, RK, ghost. Action: forced password reset. Signature attempt: failed. Protocol: identity theft. "Is this true?" Alistair asked, his voice barely a whisper. He looked at the screen, then at his son. "Did you try to spoof her signature? Did you try to forge a federal document?" "We had to," Huxley blurted out, his voice cracking with hysteria. "The shipment was spoiling. The ambient temperature was rising. She locked us out, Dad. We were trying to save the contract." "You were trying to save your own ego," I corrected him, turning to look Huxley dead in the eye. "By committing wire fraud, by violating the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, by falsifying a record mandated by the Food and Drug Administration. You didn't try to save the company, Huxley. You tried to cover up a crime, and in doing so, you triggered a mandatory report to the FBI Cyber Division. That report was sent automatically at 10:48 a.m. Agents are likely drafting the subpoena as we speak." Silas slammed his hand on the table. "We can fix the legal issue. We can claim it was a glitch. But you," he hissed, turning his venom back to me, "you are holding the encryption keys hostage. That software belongs to Aura Biotech. If you do not unlock it right now, we will sue you for theft of intellectual property and damages." "Actually," I said, sliding a thick, bound document across the polished table toward Alistair, "it doesn't, and neither does this building, nor the fleet of refrigerated trucks sitting at the dock, nor the land we are standing on." Alistair picked up the document. His hands were shaking. It was the master capitalization table. "I don't understand," he muttered, scanning the pages. "The Vane Family Trust owns 51% of the operating stock. We are the majority shareholders. I have the certificates. You own 51% of Aura Biotech Operations Incorporated," I explained gently, stepping closer to him. "That is the operating entity. It pays the salaries, it buys the coffee, and it holds the liability insurance. But that company owns nothing, Alistair. It leases everything." I swiped my finger across the iPad, and a new slide appeared. It showed the corporate structure I had architected over 15 years. At the top of the pyramid sat a holding company called Vance Ventures. "Do you remember the crash of 2008? I asked, lowering my voice. "When the bank threatened to foreclose on the original warehouse in Newark, you couldn't make payroll. You asked me to take a 50% pay cut. I agreed, but in exchange, I asked for convertible debt notes collateralized by the real estate assets. You signed them because you were desperate for cash flow." Alistair's face went ashen as the memory surfaced. He had signed those papers without reading the fine print, grateful that his COO was willing to share the burden of the recession. And 2014? I continued, relentless, the European expansion. You needed capital to buy the new fleet, but you didn't want to dilute your family's voting rights in the public operating company. So I offered to finance the fleet personally through my private fund in exchange for the intellectual property rights to the Athena protocol software I had written. You signed the licensing agreement because it kept the debt off your balance sheet and made the quarterly reports look pretty for the investors. I pointed to the box at the top of the pyramid. Vance Ventures, which is solely owned by me, holds the deeds to the real estate, the titles to the trucks, and the copyright to the software code. Through the conversion of those debt notes and the accumulated interest over 15 years, my equity stake in the asset-holding entity is not minority. It is 72%. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the sound of oxygen leaving a vacuum. Silas Mercer looked as if he had been punched in the gut. He scrambled for the papers Alistair was holding, flipping through them frantically, his eyes widening as he realized the magnitude of his due diligence failure. He had audited the tenant, but he had never bothered to check the landlord. You fired the chief operating officer, I said, leaning over the table. That was a mistake. But when you tried to force the lock, you attempted to break into a property you do not own. You tried to evict the landlord, and under the terms of our lease agreement, Section 12B, regarding criminal conduct on the premises, I am now exercising my right to terminate the lease, effective immediately. You can't do that, Silas whispered, his voice trembling. That would bankrupt the operating company instantly. Exactly, I said. I can lease this warehouse to Amazon tomorrow. They are looking for cold storage space. Vance Ventures will be fine. But Aura Biotech? Without a building, without trucks, and without software? It ceases to exist by close of business today. Alistair looked up at me. The fight had gone out of him. He looked at his son, who was staring at the floor, tears silently tracking down his face. The boy king had realized he was naked. The bank? Alistair croaked. They called me. They raised the rates to 25%. I know, I said. I called them. I told them the collateral, my assets, was at risk due to executive misconduct. They are sending a foreclosure team. They should be here in about 20 minutes. I reached into my bag and pulled out a final document. It was a single page. I placed it in front of Alistair, next to his gold pen. This is a deed of surrender and corporate restructuring, I said. It is very simple. First, Silas Mercer is terminated for cause. We will sue his firm for malpractice to recover every dime of his consulting fees. Second, Huxley Vane resigns from all executive positions and surrenders his personal stock to the Treasury to cover the $40 million risk he created today. Third, the board is reconstituted, with myself appointed as chairwoman with absolute veto power. And if I don't sign? Alistair asked, though he already knew the answer. Then I walk out, I said. I let the FBI investigation proceed. I let the FDA revoke the license. I let the bank foreclose. And you, Alistair, will go down in history not as the founder of a logistics empire, but as the man whose son went to federal prison for wire fraud. Alistair looked at Huxley. He looked at the pen. He picked it up. His hand was shaking, but he uncapped it. I'm sorry, Rowena, he whispered. I lost sight of what mattered. I know, I said softly. Sign the paper. He signed. He slid the paper to Huxley. Sign it, Alistair commanded, his voice harsh with a father's disappointment. Huxley signed, his signature barely a scrawl. I took the paper. I checked the signatures. Then I turned to Silas. Get out. You haven't heard the last of Silas began. Robert. I spoke into the air, and the door opened. Robert stepped in, flanked by 2 guards. Mr. Mercer is trespassing. Escort him out and ensure he takes nothing but his coat. His laptop is now evidence. Silas was hauled out, sputtering threats that died in the hallway. I turned to Huxley. Go home, Huxley. You're done. Huxley stood up, stripped off his tie, and walked out without a word. I have a shipment to release, I said to Alistair. I walked out of the boardroom and headed to the IT center. The technicians parted for me. I sat at the terminal, inserted my titanium key, and scanned my thumb. Access granted. I typed, restore, protocol, The red screens turned green. The warehouse doors opened. The hum of the cooling units returned. I picked up the phone. Load the trucks. We move in 5 minutes. 1 month later, I stood in my office. The name on the wall outside now read Vance Logistics. I watched the warehouse floor below. Huxley was there, wearing a hard hat, driving a forklift. He was starting over, from the bottom, learning the respect he should have had from the start. I sat at my desk. The temperature was 68 degrees. Perfect. I went back to work. Silence isn't weakness. Often, it is the loudest form of strategy. Rowena didn't fight for her seat, she simply reminded them who owned the table. True leverage isn't about making empty threats, but about becoming so essential that your absence causes the collapse. If you have ever quietly walked away from a place that didn't recognize your worth, only to watch it crumble without you, you are not alone. If this story spoke to you, please like, comment your thoughts below, and share it with someone who is still building their own foundation.